Hello, I'm Justin, that's Colin, and welcome to the Beyond Michigan podcast. The topic for today's episode is sports and the original four. Before we get started, let's go over the broad history of sports.
Early on in human history, people needed to chase down their food. For example, if someone shot their food with a bow and arrow and it was a ways away, that person wouldn't want to take a while to walk over there. So they would run to cut the time and get their food and therefore get back to their community, stationary or not, for supper.
During the agricultural revolution, communities started settling down and started growing crops like wheat, creating countries like Mesopotamia, the earliest recorded human civilization. That created a lack of physical activity while the demand remained high, at least for the time, and eventually running for sport and recreation became more of a thing instead of just for food.
The earliest recorded sports date back to ancient Greece and other countries around that time period. Examples include 100-meter dashes and wrestling, which were part of the ancient Greek Olympics.
Societally, soldiers used sports to stay in shape for war. Even if there was no ongoing conflict, sports were a good alternative to two countries fighting in a conflict. Although it did also have a possibility of creating conflict, like the football war of 1969 between Nicaragua and Honduras.
About 7 decades before that, modern Olympics were invented, including several events with several sports. But what is a sport? People's answers will vary as they have different beliefs on what a sport is.
But in the context of today's episode, a sport is something where two or more people compete against each other or against a different group of similar size for a common goal, to win. This, by definition, means the first item on our list is a sport when used in a competition, nonetheless. That upcoming topic is none other than running and sprinting when in a match.
The current rules for sprint events, whether in the Olympics or at a track or cross-country event, is the participants will line up at the starting line and will count their race by some indicator like the shooting of a blank gun or a 3-2-1 countdown.
They continue the race with obstacles like hurdles or hills or nothing at all until they reach their designated finish lines.
Recreational running doesn't have any set rules as it's not an organized thing outside organized events. Outside a uniform provided by the league/association or team, there's no required equipment needed for an ordinary run or sprint meet. Now to start the history of running, it has been part of human history for several thousand years.
Running was necessary for human survival as they needed the ability to run to chase down food after it was killed to bring back to their community. Fast forward to written history, running and sprinting was less of a requirement to have in case it came necessary to use.
Continuing the progression of time to the ancient Greeks, free Greek men were able to compete in the early versions of the Olympics, including in the race event, the sole event for 13 Olympic cycles. The Olympics also provide a greater opportunity for soldiers to remain in shape in the event of war.
A couple thousand years later, the ancient Greek Olympics ceased. We reach today's time. There are several run and sprint events at the Olympic Games nowadays, which is an indicator that throughout the progression of human history, running has become a sport of recreation and not one of necessary survival. Wrestling, however, is more cut and dry in comparison to running and sprinting in terms of its history due to it not being such a fundamental part of human history, so to speak. But before we get into the history of wrestling, let's talk about the rules of the most common form of wrestling per EvolveMMA.com, freestyle.
Wrestlers compete in 2 3-minute periods with a 30-second pause between periods. Their main objective is pinning the other's shoulders or victory by fall, the latter of which is a rarity in the Olympics. The most common route to victory is by how many points each wrestler scores.
Points can be earned by the maneuvers each wrestler executes, including but not limited to legal holds, takedowns, reversals, throws, or exposing their opponents back to the mat for several seconds. And by opponent miscues, such as illegal holds and trying to avoid holds.
For a win to be granted in the event of a tie, the tiebreakers are in order, least amount of cautions, and final point scored. There is a mercy rule where a wrestler automatically wins if they have a 10-plus point lead, according to Olympics.com. The materials not provided by the league are bands, knee pads, and mouth guards, shoes, headgear, and a singlet.
Which is a clothing for the uniform. As for the actual history of the sport, wrestling was invented circa 3000 BC in ancient Greece. Wrestling was likely an indicator that war wasn't as much of a threat as it has been before, although wrestling was used as a way to keep soldiers prepared for hand-to-hand combat in war.
This version, Greco-Roman wrestling, was part of the ancient Greek Olympics in 708 BC. Fast forward to the modern-day Olympics in 1902, a freestyle version of wrestling, the version we described earlier, was proposed to be added to the Olympics.
Every country except the United States accepted this proposition. This version didn't replace the Greco-Roman version as it still exists in the Olympics today. Instead, both are held as part of a wrestling event in the Summer Olympics.
Moving on to archery. In archery, the objective of the game is to be the most accurate out of all your opponents by being the one to shoot the arrows closest to the center of the target. In the Olympic rules for archery, a player must stand 77 yards away from the target and no less, but the distance can vary depending on the league that is being played.
When you shoot an arrow in archery, you will be scored on a 0-10 on how close you were to the center of a target, with 0 being they missed entirely, and a 10 being hit to the center of the target, which some would refer to as a bullseye.
If you look at a typical archery player, you'll likely see them wear some kind of glasses and probably some gloves as well. Before archery became a sport, the bow and arrow was used to hunt prey for food so you don't starve.
People started using archery as a test of accuracy, and many people, such as ancient Egyptians and Greeks, used it to train whenever they're fighting other people. Although the bows and arrows in combat have decreased because we have weapons that are far more efficient, archery is still played in the Olympics to this day.
In a swimming race, the players start at a starting point, like a starting line, starting block, etc., and after the signal 3, 2, 1 countdown or a whistle, all players dive into the water and swim to the finish, and whoever makes it there first is the winner. In terms of tools besides a body of water, it doesn't really require anything, but it is recommended to use gear like goggles or swimming cap.
Now, in terms of history for swimming, recreational swimming was introduced in about 2500 BC. It is very likely that people swam long before when recreational swimming was introduced, but then became a sport.
In ancient Greek times, they used recreational swimming as a method of training in case there was a shipwreck in a naval battle. Fast forward thousands of years, swimming isn't necessarily required, but more a basic life skill for people to learn.
Nowadays, there are sports in the modern Olympics that don't involve swimming, like water polo. Water polo was a sport invented in Scotland in the late 19th century, in which a player has to advance the ball by passing it to another player or moving the ball by creating wakes that the ball rides on.
These 4 sports, running, wrestling, archery, and swimming, are the 4 oldest sports that are around today.
There's nothing left that we have to say for this part of the podcast. Again, I'm Justin, that's Colin, and this is the Beyond Michigan podcast.